"Your mother didn't lose the money," Daniel Whitmore said one night at the dinner table, his voice calm and certain. "She spent it all herself and then tried to blame everyone else." For most of her life, Emily Whitmore had heard some version of that sentence. It was repeated so often that it became part of the family history, the kind of story that no one questioned anymore. Her father would say it in quiet conversations after holidays, in casual remarks when finances came up, even sometimes with a tired shake of his head, as if he were remembering a long, exhausting chapter of his life. According to Daniel, Margaret Whitmore had always been irresponsible with money. He said she opened accounts without telling him, made strange purchases, and created problems that forced him to step in and save the family. Emily had grown up believing that version of events because it was the only version she ever heard. When she was young, she remembered small moments that seemed to confirm it. Tense conversations behind closed doors, her father reviewing bank statements late at night at the kitchen table, and the quiet way her mother sometimes tried to explain something only to stop when Daniel walked into the room. By the time Emily was 20, the marriage had ended and Margaret had moved away to a small apartment across town. Daniel explained the situation carefully, presenting it like a practical decision made after years of trying to help someone who simply refused to take responsibility. He said Margaret had become confused about money, that she misunderstood normal transactions and imagined problems that weren't really there. Family members nodded sympathetically when he told the story. Friends repeated it when Emily asked why her parents had separated. Over time, the narrative hardened into something permanent. Margaret Whitmore was the woman who lost control of the family finances. Daniel Whitmore was the man who spent years cleaning up the mess. Emily accepted it because she had no reason not to. Her father had always seemed organized, disciplined, and reliable. He balanced budgets, paid bills on time, and spoke about money with the calm authority of someone who understood exactly how everything worked. Her mother, by contrast, became quieter after the divorce, almost invisible in family gatherings that happened less and less frequently. Sometimes Emily wondered if the truth was more complicated, but every time she considered the possibility, Daniel would repeat the same explanation with the same patient certainty. And so the years passed. Margaret lived a quiet life in a modest apartment about 30 miles away. Emily visited occasionally, bringing groceries or helping fix small things around the place, but the subject of money rarely came up. Margaret would change the topic whenever finances were mentioned, offering a soft smile and asking about Emily's job or the weather instead. It seemed easier that way. Then one Thursday afternoon, everything began to change. Emily was at work when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Leonard Collins, who introduced himself as the manager of a storage facility on the edge of town. He spoke politely, but with the careful tone of someone delivering information that might be unexpected. He explained that a storage unit registered to Margaret Whitmore had not been paid for several months. Because Emily was listed as an emergency contact, the facility was required to reach out before taking further action. Emily paused, confused. She didn't remember her mother ever mentioning a storage unit. Collins continued explaining the situation, describing paperwork, overdue payments, and the possibility that the contents of the unit might eventually be auctioned if the issue wasn't resolved. Emily thanked him for the call and promised she would look into it. After she hung up, she sat quietly at her desk, staring at the phone in her hand. Something about the conversation unsettled her, though she couldn't immediately explain why. Her mother had never owned very much. The apartment she lived in was small, the furniture simple, the closets nearly empty except for a few neatly folded clothes. Emily had always assumed that Margaret had downsized after the divorce because she wanted a quieter life. But a storage unit suggested something else entirely, something hidden away for years without explanation. That evening, Emily drove home along the familiar highway that stretched 20 miles between her office and her house. The sun was already low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the road. As the miles passed, the thought of that storage unit kept returning to her mind. Somewhere, in a locked space she had never seen, her mother had been keeping something important enough to store for years. Emily didn't know what she expected to find there, but a quiet feeling began to grow in the back of her mind, a small, persistent doubt that the story she had believed for 25 years might not be the whole truth. The phone call stayed in Emily Whitmore's mind long after the workday ended. The highway outside her windshield stretched in a straight gray ribbon for miles, but her thoughts kept circling the same quiet question. Why would Margaret Whitmore rent a storage unit and never mention it to anyone? Her mother had always lived simply, almost carefully, the way someone does after learning how quickly life can change. Emily could still picture the small apartment Margaret moved into after the divorce. It was less than 800 square feet, a modest place on the third floor of a quiet building near a grocery store and a pharmacy. There had been no expensive furniture, no boxes stacked in closets, nothing that suggested there were belongings stored somewhere else. Margaret kept only what she needed. That was the image Emily had carried for 25 years. Yet the storage facility manager had sounded certain. The account had been open for years. Not months, not recently opened, but years. Emily turned into her driveway, just as the last orange light of sunset faded from the sky. Her house sat at the end of a quiet suburban street where the lawns were carefully trimmed and the mailboxes all looked the same. Normally the calm routine of the neighborhood helped her unwind after work, but tonight the silence felt different. Inside the house, she set her keys on the kitchen counter and stood still for a moment, remembering how often her father had spoken about the past. Daniel Whitmore had always told the story the same way. Margaret had misunderstood money. She had accused him of things that never happened. She had created confusion that forced the family to separate finances. Every time he told it, he sounded patient, almost sympathetic, like someone explaining a sad but unavoidable situation. Over time, the story had become part of Emily's understanding of her childhood. She remembered sitting at the kitchen table when she was 14 while Daniel sorted through envelopes and bank statements. He had sighed and said quietly that managing money alone was harder than people realized. At the time, she thought he meant the responsibility of paying bills. Now, she wondered if there had been more behind those words. Emily opened the refrigerator, poured herself a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. She tried to recall the last time her mother had mentioned anything about financial problems. Margaret rarely spoke about money at all. If anything, she seemed careful to avoid the subject entirely. When Emily offered to help pay for something, Margaret would smile and say she was managing just fine. That answer had always sounded sincere, but now it felt incomplete, as if part of the conversation had never been spoken aloud. The storage unit kept returning to her thoughts like a quiet echo. Somewhere across town, there was a locked space her mother had been paying for year after year. Emily imagined rows of metal doors inside a long concrete building, each one hiding someone's forgotten belongings. What could Margaret have stored there that she felt needed to be kept away from home for so long? Old furniture seemed unlikely. Family photos would have been kept close. Clothing or personal items would not require a monthly payment for decades. The more Emily considered the possibilities, the more the mystery grew heavier in her mind. Finally, she reached for her phone and opened the note where she had written down the address Mr. Collins had given her. The storage facility sat about 12 miles from her office, near an industrial stretch of road she rarely visited. It would take perhaps 20 minutes to drive there in the morning. Emily looked at the address again and felt the same quiet unease she had felt when the call first came. For most of her life, she believed she understood what happened between her parents. Tonight, for the first time in 25 years, she was no longer certain. The next morning, Emily Whitmore woke earlier than usual. The sky outside her bedroom window was still pale gray, the quiet kind of morning that usually belonged to people who started work before sunrise. She stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee in her hands, staring out at the empty street, while the same thought repeated in her mind. Somewhere 12 miles away, there was a locked metal door connected to her mother's name. For 25 years, Emily had believed she understood the story of her parents. Now a single phone call had placed a question mark over everything she thought she knew. By 8 o'clock, she was already in her car, driving toward the industrial district where the storage facility was located. The roads grew wider as she left the residential neighborhoods behind. Warehouses replaced houses. Delivery trucks moved slowly through intersections. The buildings looked practical and unremarkable, long rows of concrete structures designed only to store things people no longer had room for. Emily followed the address written in her phone until she saw the sign for Collins Secure Storage standing beside a chain-link fence. Inside the gate stretched several long buildings lined with identical roll-up doors. The place looked quiet, almost forgotten. Emily parked near the small office at the front of the property. The glass door opened with a soft chime when she stepped inside. Behind the counter stood a man in his late 50s wearing a neatly pressed blue shirt with a name tag that read Leonard Collins. He recognized her name immediately when she introduced herself. His expression shifted to polite understanding, the same careful tone he had used during their phone call. He explained again that the unit had been rented under Margaret Whitmore's name for many years and that the payment account had recently stopped processing. According to the records, the monthly fee had been automatically charged for more than 2 decades without interruption. Emily felt a quiet surprise at that detail. Her mother had been paying for this space every single month while living in a modest apartment that barely had room for extra furniture. Collins slid a clipboard across the counter and asked Emily to sign a form confirming she had permission to access the unit as the emergency contact on file. His office smelled faintly of paper and cleaning solution. Through the window, Emily could see the long corridor of metal doors outside reflecting the pale morning light. After signing the form, Collins reached into a drawer and placed a small brass key beside the clipboard. The unit number was written clearly on a tag attached to the ring. He gave her simple directions across the property and offered to answer questions if she needed help once she reached the door. Emily thanked him and stepped back outside into the cool air of the storage yard. The buildings were quiet except for the distant hum of a passing truck on the highway. She walked slowly down the concrete path between rows of identical units until she found the number written on the key tag. The door looked the same as every other door in the building. Plain metal. A small lock. Nothing about it suggested it had been quietly guarding part of her mother's life for more than 20 years. Emily stood there for a moment with the key in her hand. A strange stillness settled around her, as if the entire morning had been leading to this single moment. For most of her life, she believed the past had already been explained. Yet now she was standing in front of a locked door that seemed to hold a version of that past no one had ever told her about. Slowly she inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The lock clicked open with a soft metallic sound that seemed louder than it should have in the quiet storage yard. Emily Whitmore placed her hand under the metal handle and slowly lifted the door. The rolling panels rattled upward until a narrow strip of shadowed space appeared beneath it. Dust floated in the thin beam of morning light that slipped inside. For a moment, Emily simply stood there, her hand still resting on the handle as if she were unsure whether to continue. Then she raised the door the rest of the way and stepped forward. The unit was larger than she expected, perhaps 10 feet wide and 15 feet deep. It did not look like the cluttered space she imagined when she first heard the word storage unit. Instead, everything inside was organized with careful precision. Along the left wall stood 3 metal shelves stacked with labeled cardboard boxes. On the right side were several plastic containers sealed with tape. At the very back of the unit sat 2 gray filing cabinets and a small wooden desk that looked as though it had once belonged in a home office. Nothing about the space looked abandoned. In fact, it looked as though someone had arranged it deliberately, almost like a quiet archive. Emily stepped farther inside, the cool concrete floor echoing lightly under her shoes. Each box on the shelves had a label written in the same neat handwriting. Dates were printed carefully across the sides. 1998, 1999, 2000. The pattern continued year after year. The realization settled slowly in Emily's mind. Her mother had not simply stored random belongings here. She had been building something over time. Emily reached for the nearest box and lifted it from the shelf. It was heavier than it looked. She carried it to the small desk near the back wall and set it down carefully before opening the lid. Inside were folders arranged in perfect rows. Each folder was marked with a bank name and a specific month. Emily pulled one out and opened it. The first page was a bank statement printed on thick white paper. At the top of the document was the account holder's name, Margaret Whitmore. Emily frowned slightly as she turned the page. The statement listed a series of withdrawals and transfers. Most of them were amounts large enough to catch her attention immediately. $1,000, $2,000, sometimes more. Emily flipped through the pages, expecting to see some explanation written in the margins or attached to the documents. Instead, the statements continued month after month, each one carefully preserved. She opened another folder and then another. They contained the same type of documents. Bank statements, transfer confirmations, copies of official financial records. Emily slowly looked back at the shelves lining the wall behind her. Dozens of boxes stood there, each one labeled with a different year. 25 years of carefully stored paperwork. A quiet uneasiness moved through her chest as the meaning of it began to settle in her thoughts. No one keeps records this detailed without a reason. Emily returned her attention to the document in her hands. Her eyes moved slowly down the page until something unusual caught her attention. Beside one of the withdrawal entries was a signature authorization line. The handwriting did not belong to her mother. Emily recognized the shape of the letters immediately because she had seen them on birthday cards and legal forms her entire life. The name written beside the withdrawal was Daniel Whitmore. Emily Whitmore stared at the signature for a long moment without moving. The name on the authorization line was clear, written in the steady handwriting she had recognized since childhood. Daniel Whitmore. Her father. For a few seconds, she told herself there must be some simple explanation. Perhaps the account had once been shared. Perhaps he had signed something years ago before the divorce. But the uneasiness in her chest did not fade. Instead, it grew heavier as she turned the page and saw the next statement behind it. The same pattern appeared again. A withdrawal entry. A signature authorization. Daniel Whitmore. Emily slowly sat down in the chair beside the desk, the paper still held carefully between her fingers. The quiet inside the storage unit seemed deeper now, as though the air itself had become still. She opened another folder from the same box. Then another. Each one contained more statements from the same account. The months moved forward in sequence like chapters in a long record. And again, besides certain withdrawals, the same signature appeared. Daniel Whitmore. The amounts were not small. Some transfers were $1,000. Others were $3,000 or even $5,000. Emily began to flip through the pages faster, scanning the documents with growing disbelief. The withdrawals were not isolated events. They formed a pattern that stretched across years. Month after month, sometimes several times within the same year, money had been removed from Margaret Whitmore's account with her father's authorization. Emily leaned back slightly and looked again toward the shelves lining the wall. Dozens of boxes waited there, each one representing another year of records. If the first folder already showed this pattern, what would the rest of them reveal? She stood up and walked slowly to the shelf, pulling down a second box labeled 2004. Inside were the same carefully arranged folders. She opened one at random. Another statement. Another list of withdrawals. Another signature. Daniel Whitmore. Emily felt a strange mixture of confusion and disbelief move through her thoughts. All her life, she had heard the same explanation repeated again and again. Her mother had spent money recklessly. Her mother had caused the financial problems that eventually destroyed the marriage. Yet the documents in front of her told a completely different story. Margaret Whitmore had not destroyed the account. Someone else had been moving money out of it for years. Emily returned to the desk and spread several statements side by side across the surface. The dates stretched across decades. 1999, 2002, 2006, 2010. The handwriting beside the withdrawal lines remained the same. Calm, consistent, unmistakable. Daniel Whitmore. A faint sound from outside drifted into the unit as a truck passed somewhere beyond the fence. Emily barely noticed it. Her attention remained fixed on the documents. Slowly, another realization began to take shape in her mind. These papers had not been thrown into boxes randomly. They had been organized with care, year by year, statement by statement, almost as if someone had been building a record of something important. Margaret Whitmore had spent 25 years preserving these documents. She had paid for this storage unit every month just to keep them safe. Emily looked again at the shelves filled with labeled boxes and felt a quiet chill move through her thoughts. Her mother had not been storing old furniture or forgotten belongings here. She had been storing evidence. Emily Whitmore remained seated at the small desk inside the storage unit for a long time, staring at the rows of statements spread across the wooden surface. The morning light from the open door had shifted slightly, stretching across the concrete floor and touching the edges of the papers like a quiet spotlight. Each document seemed ordinary on its own. A bank name, a monthly balance, a series of transactions printed in neat black text. But together they formed a pattern that Emily could no longer ignore. She picked up one of the statements again and studied the withdrawal entry beside the signature line. Daniel Whitmore. The handwriting was steady and confident, the kind of signature someone writes without hesitation. Emily had seen that same handwriting on birthday cards, tax forms, and holiday notes for as long as she could remember. It had always represented reliability to her, the careful order her father kept in every part of his life. Now it appeared again and again across pages that told a completely different story. She turned toward the shelves once more and realized the box she opened earlier represented only 1 year. One small section of the timeline. The other boxes stretched across the wall like a quiet record of time passing. If each one contained the same kind of documentation, then the story inside this unit was far larger than a few unusual withdrawals. Emily stood up and walked to the shelf labeled 1998. The cardboard felt firm and slightly dusty as she lifted the lid. Inside were more folders, each one carefully marked with a month and a bank name. She pulled out the first folder and opened it slowly. The statement inside looked nearly identical to the others. Margaret Whitmore's account information printed clearly at the top. A list of deposits and withdrawals arranged neatly below. And once again, several large transactions appeared alongside the same familiar authorization signature. Daniel Whitmore. Emily felt a quiet tension building in her thoughts as she flipped through the pages. The pattern repeated in February, then again in April, then again in July. The amounts varied, but the signature remained constant. She set the papers back inside the folder and closed the box with careful hands. A strange realization was forming as she looked across the rows of containers. For 25 years, her mother had been gathering these records one by one, storing them away like pieces of a puzzle no one else knew existed. Margaret Whitmore had never spoken about it. She had never shown Emily a single document. Instead, she quietly paid the monthly storage fee and continued adding to the collection year after year. Emily walked back to the desk and noticed something she had not examined yet. Beside the folders of bank statements sat a thin notebook with a dark blue cover. The edges of the pages looked slightly worn, suggesting it had been opened many times. Emily hesitated before picking it up. The notebook felt lighter than the folders, but somehow more personal. Slowly, she opened the first page. The handwriting inside was unmistakable. Margaret Whitmore had written the entries in careful lines that filled the page from top to bottom. Each entry contained a date, followed by a short note. Emily began reading the first one she saw. The sentence was simple and direct. Today, another withdrawal appeared that I did not authorize. I told Daniel, and he said the bank must have made an error. Emily turned the page. Another entry waited beneath it. The date was 2 months later. The words were slightly longer this time. I tried to explain to Daniel that the money keeps disappearing. He told me I am imagining things again. Emily felt the quiet air inside the storage unit grow heavier as she read the next page. And the next. Each entry described the same situation repeating again and again. Withdrawals from the account. Confusion. Conversations where Margaret tried to ask questions and was told she was mistaken. Emily slowly closed the notebook and placed it back on the desk. The silence inside the storage unit felt different now, almost like the space itself had been holding these words for years, waiting for someone else to finally read them. Emily Whitmore kept the notebook open on the desk for several minutes, reading the entries slowly, as if each line required time to settle in her mind. The handwriting remained steady from page to page, the careful script of someone who wanted to be precise. Margaret Whitmore had written each date clearly at the top of the entry, sometimes followed by only a single sentence, other times by a short paragraph describing another conversation or another moment of confusion. Emily turned to a page near the middle of the notebook and read quietly. Today I went to the bank to ask about the missing money. The teller showed me the withdrawal records and said the authorization was already on file. When I asked Daniel, he told me again that I was mistaken and that the bank must be confusing the accounts. Emily continued turning pages. The entries formed a pattern that matched the statements stacked around the room. A withdrawal would appear in the bank record. Margaret would notice the missing funds. Then a conversation would follow in which Daniel explained that nothing unusual had happened. Over time, the notes began to include Margaret's uncertainty about herself. One entry read that she wondered if perhaps she had forgotten something important. Another entry mentioned that Daniel suggested she should stop worrying about finances altogether because the stress was affecting her judgment. Emily felt a quiet weight building in her chest as she read those words. For most of her life, she had heard that same explanation repeated by her father. He had spoken calmly about the situation, describing Margaret as someone who misunderstood the numbers and imagined problems where none existed. Yet the notebook told a completely different story. Margaret Whitmore had been documenting each event carefully, almost like someone trying to prove that her memory was not failing her. Emily turned to another page dated several years later. The handwriting looked slightly heavier, as if written with more pressure against the paper. Today Daniel told Emily and Jason that I am having trouble keeping track of money again. They looked worried, and I did not know how to explain what is happening. I tried to show Daniel the statements, but he said, "The bank records can be confusing if you do not understand how accounts work." Emily lowered the notebook slowly. She remembered that conversation from years ago. She had been sitting at the kitchen table while her father explained that managing finances required experience and patience. At the time his words sounded reasonable. Now the memory felt different, as though an important detail had been hidden inside a perfectly calm explanation. Emily walked to the back of the unit where the two gray filing cabinets stood beside the wall. She opened the top drawer of the first cabinet and found more folders inside. These were labeled with dates that stretched across decades, just like the boxes on the shelves. Each folder contained copies of bank correspondence, letters from financial institutions, and notes written in Margaret's careful handwriting. It became clear that the notebook was only a small part of what Margaret had been building here. This entire room was a record of something she had been trying to understand for 25 years. Emily returned to the desk and looked once more at the statement lying open in front of her. The signature beside the withdrawal still stood out sharply against the white paper. Daniel Whitmore. The same name appeared again and again across the documents surrounding her. For most of her life, Emily believed the story her father told about money and confusion. Now she was sitting inside a quiet storage unit filled with records that suggested her mother had been trying to show the truth for decades, even though no one had been willing to listen. Emily Whitmore sat quietly at the small desk for a long time after closing the notebook. The silence inside the storage unit felt heavier now, as though the air itself carried the weight of everything Margaret Whitmore had written down over the years. Outside, somewhere beyond the metal walls, a truck passed on the nearby road, but the sound faded quickly and left the space quiet again. Emily looked around the unit slowly. What she had first thought was a simple storage space now looked more like a carefully built archive. The boxes, the folders, the filing cabinets, even the small desk placed against the back wall all suggested the same thing. Margaret had not been storing random belongings. She had been preserving a record of events. Emily reached again for the blue notebook and opened it to a page she had not yet read. The entry was dated nearly 15 years after the first one she saw earlier. The handwriting looked the same, but the words were slightly longer. Daniel told the children today that I am confused about money again. He said the stress is making me imagine problems that do not exist. I tried to show him the statements, but he would not look at them. Emily paused there, remembering how often her father had said those exact words when she was younger. He would speak calmly, explaining that finances could be complicated and that Margaret sometimes misunderstood the numbers. At the time, Emily believed him because his voice always sounded reasonable. She turned the page. The next entry was written several months later. I went to the bank again and asked if someone else had access to the account. The manager said the authorization form already includes Daniel's signature. He told me that married couples often share financial permissions like this. Emily read the line again, more slowly this time. Authorization form. She looked back toward the filing cabinet and suddenly remembered the folders she had seen inside earlier. Emily stood up and crossed the small space to the cabinet. When she opened the second drawer, she found another row of carefully labeled folders. One label stood out immediately because it was written in slightly larger letters than the others. Account authorization documents. Emily pulled the folder from the drawer and carried it back to the desk. The papers inside were older than the bank statements she had been reading. Some of them were photocopies of forms filled out decades earlier. Margaret's name appeared at the top of several pages as the primary account holder. Beneath that was another section labeled Authorized Access. Emily felt her breath slow as she read the name written in the blank space. Daniel Whitmore. The signature beneath it matched the same handwriting she had already seen on the bank statements. Emily turned to the next page. It was a letter from the bank confirming that authorized withdrawals could be made by the secondary signer listed on the account. The letter was dated nearly 25 years earlier. Emily leaned back slightly in the chair, the papers resting in her hands. The meaning of the documents was becoming clearer with every page she read. Margaret Whitmore had not imagined the withdrawals. The account records, the authorization forms, and the careful notes written in the notebook all pointed to the same conclusion. For years, money had been taken from the account with Daniel's permission. Yet the story told to the family had always been that Margaret was the one who could not manage her finances. Emily looked again at the shelves filled with boxes labeled by year. Suddenly she understood why Margaret had kept everything. Every statement, every letter, every form had been saved because together they told a story that no one else had been willing to hear. Emily Whitmore sat quietly with the authorization documents spread across the desk in front of her. The metal walls of the storage unit seemed to hold the silence tightly around her, as if the room itself had been waiting years for someone to finally understand what these papers meant. She looked again at the bank letter confirming that Daniel Whitmore had authorized access to Margaret Whitmore's account. The document was official, printed on bank letterhead with a date that reached back more than 2 decades. That date mattered more than anything else she had seen so far. It meant that the account had not been secretly manipulated behind Margaret's back. The bank had recognized Daniel's signature as an approved user. Yet the withdrawals listed in the statements were still the same ones Margaret had written about in the notebook. Emily returned to the blue notebook and opened it again, this time flipping several pages forward until she reached an entry written a few years after the authorization form had been signed. The sentence was short but clear. Daniel says he only signs the forms because the bank requires it, but he promises he will not move money without telling me first. Emily read the line twice before continuing to the next page. A later entry appeared there, written in the same steady handwriting. I asked Daniel today why the savings balance is smaller again. He said I must have misunderstood the numbers and that I should stop checking the statements because they only confuse me. Emily felt a quiet chill move through her thoughts as she compared the notebook entries with the statements spread across the desk. The timeline matched too closely to ignore. The withdrawals listed in the bank documents appeared only months after Margaret wrote about the same missing funds. The notebook described conversations where Margaret tried to question what was happening. The statements recorded the exact transactions she had been trying to understand. Emily turned another page in the notebook and found a longer entry written several years later. The writing pressed slightly deeper into the paper as if Margaret had been holding the pen more tightly. Daniel told the children tonight that I am becoming forgetful about money. I tried to show him the statements again, but he said they are difficult to read and that I am worrying about nothing. I do not know how to explain what I see in the records. Emily lowered the notebook slowly and stared at the desk. The memory described in that entry was one she recognized. She remembered sitting at the kitchen table with her brother Jason while their father spoke calmly about finances. Daniel had explained that Margaret was confused about how bank statements worked. He told them that sometimes numbers looked alarming if someone did not understand the details of financial accounts. Emily had believed him completely. At the time it sounded logical. Now the same conversation looked different when placed beside the documents in front of her. She stood and walked slowly along the shelf of labeled boxes again, reading the years written across their sides. Each one contained another piece of the same timeline. Margaret Whitmore had spent 25 years collecting records that supported the same story written in the notebook. Emily returned to the desk and looked once more at the signature on the statement lying in front of her. Daniel Whitmore. The name had always represented stability in her life. Yet the evidence surrounding her suggested that the truth behind those familiar words might be far more complicated than the explanation she had accepted for most of her life. Emily Whitmore remained seated at the desk while the quiet morning light continued to creep farther across the concrete floor of the storage unit. The papers around her no longer looked like scattered documents. They looked like pieces of a story that had been waiting years to be read in the right order. She gathered several of the statements together and aligned them carefully so the dates could be compared side by side. The pattern became even clearer when the pages were arranged that way. Withdrawals appeared every few months. Sometimes the amounts were small enough to go unnoticed at first. Other times they were large enough to reduce the account balance significantly. Each time the authorization signature appeared beside the transaction line. Daniel Whitmore. Emily noticed something else as she studied the dates more closely. The withdrawals often appeared shortly after deposits were made into the account. Margaret's salary from her job had been deposited regularly according to the statements. In many cases, the money remained in the account only a short time before another authorized withdrawal removed a portion of it. Emily leaned forward and looked again at the rows of numbers printed on the pages. Over the span of several years, the amounts added together to form a far larger total than she had expected. She picked up a calculator from the desk drawer and began adding several of the withdrawals listed in a single folder. The sum reached several $1,000s within only a few pages. Emily set the calculator down and looked again toward the shelves filled with boxes labeled by year. The realization slowly settled over her thoughts. If the same pattern continued across every box in this room, the total amount of money moved out of the account during 25 years could be far greater than anything she had imagined. She returned to the notebook and flipped to another section near the end. Margaret's handwriting there looked slightly more deliberate, as though she had become more certain about what she was recording. One entry caught Emily's attention immediately. I have begun keeping copies of every statement because the numbers do not match what Daniel tells me. I know something is wrong even if no one believes me. Emily read the line again. It explained the careful organization she had seen throughout the unit. Margaret had not simply stored documents out of habit. She had been gathering proof. Emily turned to the next page and read another entry dated several years later. Daniel told the children again tonight that I cannot manage money properly. They looked worried, and I did not know how to explain that the account records say something different. Emily felt a quiet heaviness in her chest as she lowered the notebook. Those were the same conversations she remembered from her childhood, but now they looked completely different when placed beside the evidence surrounding her. She had believed the calm explanations her father offered because they sounded reasonable at the time. Now she was sitting in a room filled with documents that suggested Margaret Whitmore had been trying to show the truth for decades. Emily gathered the statements and placed them back inside their folders with careful hands. The storage unit no longer felt like a place for forgotten belongings. It felt like a record room where the past had been preserved piece by piece. And the more Emily examined the evidence Margaret had saved, the clearer one fact became. Her mother had never been confused about the missing money. She had been documenting it. Emily Whitmore remained seated inside the storage unit for several minutes after closing the notebook again. The silence in the small concrete space felt deeper than before, as though the documents surrounding her had shifted the meaning of everything she remembered about the past. She slowly looked across the shelves once more, realizing that every box represented another year of Margaret Whitmore's careful record-keeping. Each folder, each statement, and each note had been preserved with patience that stretched across decades. Emily stood and walked along the row of boxes again, running her fingers lightly across the labels written in her mother's familiar handwriting. The years told their own quiet story. 1998, 1999, 2000, 2005, 2010. The sequence continued until it reached the most recent box near the end of the shelf. Margaret Whitmore had never stopped documenting what she saw happening in her account. Emily returned to the desk and opened one of the later folders to compare it with the earlier records. The statements from recent years looked almost identical to the older ones. Deposits appeared regularly, followed by withdrawals that carried the same authorization signature. Daniel Whitmore. The consistency of the pattern made it impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Emily began arranging several of the statements in chronological order, placing them side by side so the dates lined up clearly. The longer she looked at the pages, the more the numbers seemed to reveal the same quiet rhythm repeating again and again. Margaret's income entered the account. The balance rose. Then another withdrawal removed part of it. The sequence repeated across months, across years, across entire decades. Emily picked up the calculator again and began adding several withdrawals from a single year. The total climbed steadily with each number she entered. When she finished the page, she paused, staring at the amount displayed on the small screen. It represented only a fraction of the records stored in the room, yet the number was already significant. She imagined what the sum might become if every withdrawal listed in every box were counted together. Emily set the calculator down slowly. Her attention returned to the notebook lying beside the statements. She opened it once more and turned to a page near the end where the entries appeared closer together, as though Margaret had begun writing more frequently. One entry stood out immediately. I am keeping every record because one day someone may need to see what actually happened. Emily read the lines several times. The words were calm and direct, written without anger or exaggeration. Margaret Whitmore had simply continued documenting the truth as she saw it, even when no one else believed her explanations. Emily closed the notebook again and looked around the storage unit one more time. The room now felt less like a place where old belongings were hidden away and more like a quiet testimony preserved over time. For 25 years, Margaret Whitmore had been gathering proof that something in the family story did not match the records she was reading. Emily stood beside the desk, holding one of the statements in her hands. The familiar signature beside the withdrawal line seemed to carry a different meaning now than it had when she first noticed it earlier that morning. Daniel Whitmore. For most of her life, Emily had trusted the explanation attached to that name. Now the evidence surrounding her suggested that the truth behind those explanations had been waiting silently in this storage unit all along. Emily Whitmore stood quietly beside the desk inside the storage unit, holding one of the bank statements while the morning light continued to shift across the concrete floor. The rows of boxes behind her no longer looked like ordinary storage. They looked like a timeline, each container marking another year that Margaret Whitmore had spent gathering proof of something no one else had been willing to see. Emily slowly placed the statement back inside its folder and closed the lid of the box in front of her. The sound of the cardboard settling into place echoed softly in the quiet space. For a moment, she simply looked at the shelves again, realizing that what she had examined so far represented only a small portion of everything Margaret had saved. If the pattern continued through every box, the full story would stretch across decades. Emily walked back toward the filing cabinets and opened the second drawer again, searching through the remaining folders that she had not yet examined. One envelope near the back of the drawer looked different from the others. Instead of printed bank documents, this envelope contained several handwritten letters folded carefully into thirds. Emily recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Margaret's. She unfolded the first letter slowly and began to read. The letter was addressed to Emily, but had never been mailed. Margaret had written about the frustration of trying to explain the missing money to the bank and to Daniel. She wrote that every time she asked questions, Daniel responded calmly and told others that she was misunderstanding the records. Emily felt a quiet heaviness as she continued reading. Margaret explained that she had stopped trying to argue about the account because the conversations always ended the same way. Daniel would tell the children that Margaret was confused about finances and that he was handling the situation to keep everything stable. Emily lowered the letter and stared at the desk for a moment. She remembered those conversations clearly now. Daniel had always spoken in a steady voice, explaining that managing money required careful attention to detail and that Margaret sometimes worried about numbers that were not actually problems. At the time, his explanations sounded reassuring. Emily unfolded the second letter. This one was written several years later. Margaret described how she had begun saving copies of every bank statement because she knew that eventually someone would need to see the records for themselves. She wrote that the truth could not stay hidden forever if the documents were preserved carefully enough. Emily placed the letters back inside the envelope and returned it to the desk. The room felt different now than when she first opened the storage unit door earlier that morning. At that time, the boxes had looked like ordinary storage. Now every item inside the room carried meaning. The statements showed the movement of money over 25 years. The authorization forms explained how the withdrawals were possible. The notebook recorded Margaret's attempts to understand what was happening. And the letters revealed how long she had been waiting for someone to finally read the evidence she had been saving. Emily looked once more at the shelves stretching along the wall. For most of her life, she had believed the story Daniel Whitmore told about finances and confusion. Yet inside this quiet storage unit, Margaret Whitmore had preserved a completely different version of events, one built from records, signatures, and patient documentation collected over more than 2 decades. Emily slowly closed the filing cabinet drawer and stood still for a moment in the center of the room. The evidence surrounding her had already begun to change the way she understood the past, and she realized that she had only just begun to uncover the full story Margaret Whitmore had been quietly saving for all those years. Emily Whitmore remained standing in the center of the storage unit for several quiet moments after closing the filing cabinet. The air inside the room felt still, almost heavy with the weight of the years represented on the shelves around her. When she first arrived that morning, the unit had looked like a simple collection of boxes and paperwork. Now every shelf, every folder, and every handwritten note seemed to carry a quiet message from Margaret Whitmore. Emily walked slowly back to the desk and looked again at the envelope containing the letters her mother had written but never mailed. The paper felt thin and slightly worn, as though it had been handled many times before being placed carefully inside the folder. Emily unfolded one of the letters again and reread a section she had only glanced at earlier. Margaret had written that she stopped trying to argue about the missing money because the conversations always ended the same way. Daniel would explain calmly that the numbers were being misunderstood, and the rest of the family would accept his explanation without looking at the documents themselves. Emily felt a quiet realization forming as she read those words again. Her father had never raised his voice about the subject. He had never appeared defensive or angry. Instead, he spoke patiently, explaining financial details in a tone that sounded thoughtful and reasonable. At the time, that calm certainty had made it easy to believe his version of events. Emily folded the letter again and placed it gently back on the desk. She turned toward the shelves and selected another box from a later year that she had not yet opened. The label on the side read 2015. Inside, she found the same careful arrangement of folders and bank statements. The pattern of deposits and withdrawals continued exactly as it had in the earlier boxes. The same account, the same recurring transactions. And once again, beside many of the withdrawals, the same familiar authorization signature appeared. Daniel Whitmore. Emily flipped through the statements slowly, noticing how the balances rose and fell across the months. Margaret's income was deposited regularly, just as it had been in earlier years. Then portions of the funds disappeared again through authorized withdrawals. Emily closed the folder and looked again toward the rows of boxes that stretched across the wall. Margaret Whitmore had continued documenting these transactions long after the divorce. She had kept collecting statements, writing notes, and saving letters even when the rest of the family believed the matter had already been explained. Emily returned to the desk and opened the blue notebook once more, turning to a page written near the end. The entry was short but clear. One day Emily may want to understand what happened, so I will keep every record. Emily sat quietly after reading that line. The handwriting looked steady and thoughtful, without bitterness or anger. Margaret had simply continued writing the truth as she understood it, trusting that eventually someone would look closely enough at the documents to see the pattern she had been trying to show all along. Emily slowly closed the notebook and rested her hands on the desk. The story she had believed for most of her life had been built from conversations and explanations. The story preserved in this room had been built from records, signatures, and patient documentation collected over 25 years. And the longer Emily remained inside the storage unit, the clearer it became that Margaret Whitmore had never been documenting confusion. She had been documenting the truth. Emily Whitmore remained seated at the small desk inside the storage unit, while the quiet afternoon light slowly replaced the softer morning glow that had filled the space earlier. Hours had passed since she first opened the metal door, yet the shelves around her still held more records than she had time to examine in a single day. What she had already seen was enough to change the way she understood the past, but the documents surrounding her suggested the story continued far beyond the pages she had read. She picked up another folder from the box labeled 2015 and opened it carefully. Inside were more bank statements arranged month by month, each one preserved in the same careful order Margaret Whitmore had used throughout the entire unit. Emily placed several of them side by side across the desk. The familiar pattern appeared again. Deposits entered the account regularly. The balance rose. Then another authorized withdrawal reduced it again. And beside those transactions, the same signature appeared in steady handwriting. Daniel Whitmore. Emily studied the dates more closely and noticed something she had not considered before. The withdrawals did not always occur on the same day each month. Sometimes they appeared shortly after Margaret's income was deposited. Other times they followed several weeks later. The irregular timing suggested that the transfers were not part of an automatic system or scheduled payment. They appeared to be deliberate actions made one at a time. Emily leaned back slightly in the chair and allowed that detail to settle in her thoughts. The explanation she had heard growing up described Margaret as someone who misunderstood financial records. Yet the statements in front of her were not confusing. They were straightforward documents showing deposits, balances, and authorized withdrawals. Anyone reading them carefully could see the same pattern Margaret had been writing about in the notebook for decades. Emily opened the blue notebook again and searched for entries written during the same year as the statements on the desk. After turning several pages, she found one dated in the spring of 2015. The handwriting was calm and measured as always. I noticed another withdrawal today. Daniel says the money is being moved for investments and that the details are complicated. He told me not to worry because he understands how the accounts work. Emily read the line again. The explanation sounded familiar. Her father had often spoken about investments and financial planning in a confident tone that made the subject sound complicated to anyone who was not trained in banking. When Emily was younger, those explanations seemed convincing. Now, sitting in the quiet room surrounded by statements and letters, the same explanations felt less certain. She closed the notebook slowly and placed it beside the other documents. The shelves of labeled boxes continued across the wall, like a timeline stretching through Margaret Whitmore's life after the divorce. Year after year, Margaret had continued gathering evidence, even while the rest of the family accepted the story that she had misunderstood her own finances. Emily stood and walked once more along the row of boxes, touching the labels written in her mother's handwriting. Each year represented another chapter in the same quiet effort to preserve the truth. When she reached the end of the shelf, she turned back toward the desk and looked at the statements still spread across its surface. The documents were not emotional. They did not accuse anyone or attempt to explain motives. They simply recorded transactions exactly as they occurred. Yet together they revealed something that conversations and explanations had hidden for years. Margaret Whitmore had not been confused about the missing money. She had been documenting it carefully, waiting for the day someone else would finally read the records and see what she had been trying to show all along. Emily Whitmore stood quietly near the shelves again, her eyes moving slowly across the rows of boxes that filled the storage unit from one wall to the other. Each label written in Margaret Whitmore's careful handwriting represented another year that her mother had spent preserving documents no one else had ever seen. The longer Emily remained inside the room, the more she began to understand how deliberate this entire space was. Nothing here had been placed randomly. The desk stood near the back wall, where light from the open door could reach it during the day. The filing cabinets contained the oldest authorization records and letters. The boxes along the shelves held the bank statements arranged year by year, almost like chapters in a long and quiet history. Emily returned to the desk and opened another folder from the later years she had not yet examined. The papers inside were familiar by now. Monthly statements, transaction lists, deposit records, and scattered among them, the same authorized withdrawals that appeared again and again across the decades. Daniel Whitmore. The name had always represented stability in her childhood memories. Her father had managed bills, explained financial decisions, and spoken with a calm confidence whenever money was discussed. When Margaret questioned the missing funds years earlier, Daniel's explanations had sounded reasonable. He often described the situation as a misunderstanding caused by complicated banking records. Emily had accepted that explanation because it matched the version of events everyone around her believed. Now, sitting inside a storage unit filled with official statements, she realized the numbers themselves had never been complicated. They were clear and consistent. Deposits entered the account. Withdrawals removed portions of the balance. The same authorization signature appeared beside those transactions over and over again. Emily picked up the blue notebook once more and turned several pages until she found another entry written near the end of Margaret's record keeping. The sentence was short, but the meaning felt important after everything Emily had already seen. I do not know if anyone will ever read these documents, but the records will still exist even if the conversations are forgotten. Emily closed the notebook slowly after reading that line. Margaret Whitmore had not written those words in anger or frustration. The handwriting looked calm and steady, just like the entries from years earlier. Her mother had simply continued documenting what she saw in the financial records, trusting that written evidence would remain even if the explanations given by others changed over time. Emily walked back toward the shelves and placed the folder she had been reading back inside the box from 2015. The cardboard lid settled quietly into place. For most of her life, she had believed that the story of her parents' financial problems had already been explained. Daniel Whitmore had described the situation carefully, and everyone had accepted his version of events. Yet inside this small storage unit, Margaret Whitmore had preserved another version of the same years, one built not from explanations, but from documents that recorded exactly what had happened. Emily stood in the center of the room again and looked slowly at the shelves surrounding her. 25 years of statements, letters, and notes remained here waiting to be examined. The truth her mother had been trying to preserve had never disappeared. It had simply been waiting for someone to open the door and begin reading the records.